All right, my name is Jamie Russell. I'm going to be moderating the debate. The proposition is, did Jesus Christ really exist? CJ, the synagogue, taking the affirmative, and Godless engineer, the negative position. There'll be 15 minutes for openers each, and then followed by a 10-minute rebuttal. And then we're going to have a 30 to 60-minute open conversation dialogue, depending on how that goes. And then we'll end it with end the debate with 5-minute closing statements, followed by question and answer period. If you have questions, just tag my name, preferably in the 5-minute closing section of the debate. I'll give them a 1-minute warning, and then I'll do a hard cutoff or let them finish the thought. So that is the criteria. So take it away. And yeah.
So, hi, everybody. I am the Godless Engineer. You can find me here on YouTube as just Godless Engineer, and any other social media out there, I'm just known as Godless Engineer. I do a lot of content surrounding history and the historicity of Christianity and just atheism in general, where that intersects with multiple aspects of life. So if you're interested in any of that, then please come by and check me out.
So obviously, and I have most of this written out, so it's going to just sound like a repetition for a lot of you guys. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and get onto this. So the first thing that I want to address is what it means for a historical figure like Jesus of Nazareth to have existed. In other words, I want to address what exactly I am here to defend and what exactly I am not here to defend. That's a little, go ahead and do that there. So, and also what the criteria, I think, for you guys to actually demonstrate or to actually observe, rather, the evidence should be. So what's the standard of existence, so to speak? And so to illustrate what I mean here, I want to give the brief example of our popular Christmas figure we call Santa Claus. So the question, did Santa ever exist, is not actually a simple yes or no question. And the reason is because it's sort of yes. There was a figure named St. Nicholas of Myra who, according to most historians of the modern day, did actually exist, was a bishop in Asia Minor and did a whole bunch of fancy stuff down there that we don't necessarily need to get into. And the answer is sort of no, because there is nothing even remotely similar to the figure we consider today to be Santa Claus who has ever existed at any point in time. Nobody's out, building Christmas toys up in the North Pole and then, putting their 400-pound self down a chimney, even though a chimney is something like 2 by 2 wide, right? It just doesn't happen. So in other words, because of this huge difference we actually have between Santa Claus and St. Nicholas, it's really not just a yes or no kind of a problem, right? You have to get a little bit more, I guess, deep into the issue to actually start to answer this question as to whether or not Santa Claus existed. And this is just further complicated by the fact that even apart from the Santa Claus myth, St. Nicholas himself has a lot of very interesting stories surrounding him, which we would consider to be spurious and late and probably didn't actually happen. For example, there is a story around St. Nicholas that says he actually miraculously rose 3 children from the dead after they had been butchered and pickled in brine. I know that's not something you would associate with Santa Claus, but that's totally one of the legends that surrounds this figure. And of course, virtually nobody actually believes that happened. I'm sure certain people do, but most people don't. And yet we actually do believe that St. Nicholas did exist. And so you can see how complicated this question could end up being. So how is that relevant to the current conversation? Well, it sets parameters for what we are here to prove and what we are not here to prove, and how the listener, in my opinion, should judge the evidence. In other words, it does not suffice to say merely that a historical figure on whom Jesus is based existed. That would be like arguing Santa Claus existed at one point in time because St. Nicholas existed at one point in time. And obviously that doesn't actually work. St. Nicholas is a figure who is a lot more grounded in history, and nothing that Santa Claus does is even remotely similar to reality, right? On the other hand, we're not here to discuss miracles. We're not here to discuss resurrection claims. We're not here to discuss biblical infallibility. We're not here to discuss whether or not Jesus is God, whether or not he's the Jewish Messiah, or so on. Assuming the worst case for all of those arguments, for the sake of argument, and using these assumptions for evidence in our discussion would be like concluding that St. Nicholas did not exist because he did not raise 3 children from the brine, or that any source which claims such is untrustworthy. So for the affirmative, which is my position to be true, it must be true that a teacher in Israel called Jesus from Nazareth existed and taught that he was the Jewish Messiah in the early 1st century AD, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that his followers at least believed that he had risen from the dead. It, however, does not need to be true that he was God, was the Messiah, actually did rise from the dead, worked any miracles, or any of these other things that I would affirm as a fundamentalist Christian. So that just sets the parameters for what we're here to discuss and what we're not here to discuss, right? With all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into some of the evidence here. The first category of evidence is the biblical. While many here might be tempted to fall into the Bible is not evidence cliche, it's not a very good position to take, and virtually no historians would take it. The New Testament, at its very worst, is a collection still of 27 separate documents, which are penned before the year 100 AD, and which claim that Jesus did, in fact, exist. At best, according to the traditional understanding, it's a collection of the works of 8 separate figures who were writing between the years 41 and 65, all of which were contemporaries of Jesus, 4 of which were disciples, potentially even 5 of which were eyewitnesses, and 2 of which were claimed to be family members. The most prominent of these, the Apostle Paul, is said to, and one of these contemporaries, is said to have met personally with disciples and family members of Jesus. 4 of these 27 documents are biographical accounts of Jesus. 2 of those biographical accounts are said to be written by eyewitnesses of Jesus, and the other 2 are said to be written either by an early church historian or by somebody who was the disciple of a disciple of Jesus. All of the first 1800 years of both tradition and history claim that these were written between the years 41 and 65, with the offshoot of Revelation being written some 30 years later in about 95, 96. Even according to the modern historical understanding, though, these were still all pre-Josephine, right? Meaning written before Josephus had been writing his things. And were circulated at least the Christian faith was circulated at least by the years 50, because at least 7 of these epistles are claimed to have been written by Paul, who's writing around the years 50 to 60. And that's at the worst, of course, not assuming all the things which I am going to try and defend here today, which is the things like Markan priority, the Q hypothesis, anonymity of the Gospels, any of those things that people use to call into question Jesus's existence. They're not the point of our debate, but they are things that I am personally ready to defend against, because I don't find them true. And I think you have to build these flimsy foundations on things which themselves are built on flimsy foundations. In fact, at least one of those things I'm pretty sure Godless would agree with me on, which is that the Q document did not actually ever exist. And it's a spurious invention of later historians to try and explain what they see as the synoptic problem, right? So again, even at its worst, most skeptical scholars would believe all 4 of these Gospels are pre-Josephine, that Paul wrote at least 7 epistles, that Christianity was in full swing by the 50s, and that the New Testament alone is solid evidence to believe that Jesus existed as a historical figure. Our second category of evidence is extra-biblical Christian evidence. So this is not your Josephus, your Tacitus, your stuff like that. This is actually something that people tend not to talk a lot about, but which is indeed a very important piece of evidence. Things like the Epistle of Barnabas, or the first epistle of Clement of Rome, which is believed to be the only one that is actually legitimate. The works of Papias and the works of Ignatius and Polycarp and Justin Martyr and things like that. Within 100 years of the crucifixion, so between the years 33 and 133 AD, there are between 5 and 7 different Christian sources that we have either the actual documents from observation of their words from other documents which come later, that obviously describe a living Jesus, that obviously describe this Christian group as being in full swing around the 50s and 60s and so on, and talk about the crucifixion and Pilate and all these other things. Again, one is the First Clement of Rome, another one is the Epistle of Barnabas. There is also the works of Ignatius and Papias and so on and so forth. And this is our list of evidence that, while still biased because it's from a Christian perspective, is still evidence that sometimes comes before the year 100 and all the times comes within the 1st century after Jesus' crucifixion, and which does discuss a historical and existing Jesus and a tradition of the historical existing Jesus. And then, of course, there is a third major category of evidence, which is the just extra-biblical non-Christian evidence. There's a lot of this that is not disputed. For example, it is not disputed by people outside of mythicists. I do want to be clear, because obviously mythicists dispute this, otherwise they wouldn't be mythicists, right? But nonetheless, for the most part, the majority of scholars are going to agree, for example, that Josephus in the 90s, writing after the Gospels were written, does have references to the Messiah. What we would call, at least as Christians, the Messiah. One of these, the Testimonium Flavium, is considered to be not spurious, but certainly greatly embellished. Most modern scholars would say that the stuff he talks about, is if it's worthy to call him a man and all that kind of stuff, was likely added by later scholars, but that there was at least a core there that originally existed, where Josephus was basically saying there was this figure whose name was Jesus, who some claimed to be the Messiah, and his sect is still around today. And some said that he was a wonder worker, right? Basically that kind of core. But Josephus talking about James, his brother, and he actually references James as the brother of Jesus, something which we see, of course, in the New Testament as well. This is before the year 100, and it demonstrates for us that there was a leader in Jerusalem whose name was James, who was very highly respected amongst the people, and who was the brother of somebody who claimed to be the Messiah. This is obviously extremely good evidence because it demonstrates basically exactly what the New Testament is saying. Sorry about that. My dog's just a little annoying. There's also the records of Tacitus. Tacitus is no friend in any way, shape, or form to the Christians, and Tacitus discusses this group of people who follow a man who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and basically he wants to know what to do with them. And they're obviously breaking the law, which it has such and such ruled against these different cults. There's a lot of different laws that the different cults would violate, because a lot of times Rome wouldn't actually make a certain religion illegal, but they would make certain things a religion did illegal. But that's not the point. The point is just to say, these guys are violating the law. How do I punish them? And he gets the response back saying, hey, well, don't seek them out. If you do happen to find them openly, practicing their religion, then you can punish them and all that other kind of stuff. But lo and behold, there is reference here to a existing Jesus figure who was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate, and whose sect, of course, existed into the reign of, or not into the reign, but into the time of Tacitus. Suetonius is another example of this. Pliny the Elder is another example of this. And then there is more questionable examples, but examples which are still worthy of note nonetheless. Things like Thallus, for example, people will sometimes reference the Talmud. These are a little bit more questionable, admittedly, but they are potentially evidences for Jesus Christ's historical existence. How am I doing on time, Jamie?
You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Another solid piece of evidence that is, I think, worthy of noting here is just simply the existence of Christianity itself. Now, this is a little bit more of a, I don't know what the word necessarily to use is. Complex isn't really the word, but basically the argument would go, Paul is coming into a sect that already exists, right? When Paul actually converts to Christianity, he is converting to an already existing religion, not a religion that he in any way, shape, or form is founding, right? So what is it that causes this group, sometime between the times of the Maccabean revolt, or really you can go a lot further than that, sometimes between the start of Herod's reign and the time that Pontius Pilate reigns, what is it that causes this group of Christians to become Christians, to start saying, hey, there's this Messiah who has arrived, he was the Son of God, he died on the cross for sins, rose from the dead, so on and so forth, all these kinds of things, right? Well, Occam's razor would suggest that it's not some vast conspiracy or anything like that, but that there was actually a figure who did claim these things. Whether or not these things actually would be the case would be a different kind of a conversation. Where do these 12 come from who Paul would reference, who are these pillars of the church, as he describes in other books of his, other works of his theology? Again, the most simple answer here would just be to suggest that these 12 were the leaders of a group that actually did go back to this Jesus figure. They're the 12 that we already know, these disciples, right? And this is especially more true if one starts to reject things like late dates and things of that nature. I'm going to go ahead and stop here for a moment just because I'm going to deal with my dog for a moment and let Godless kind of go into his, his arguments there. But nonetheless, I apologize for the back and forth and all that kind of stuff. I know this could have been a lot better if I had my internet working and also my dogs weren't being pests. So go right ahead and let me just go ahead and deal with this. I'll be able to hear everything.
Okay, so you want to switch to the next debater? All right, I'll start with your first. Wait, let me set it real quick. Let's see. Right, on your first word, I'll start your timer.
All right. Well, first I want to say thank you to both Jay and Jamie here for having me on for this debate. This is one of those topics that I'm very passionate about, so I'm always eager to have a debate or have a discussion on this particular topic. So, did Jesus exist? Well, throughout the course of this debate, my goal is to persuade some of you that the mythicist position isn't as crazy or as outlandish as some people may think it is. I'm going to take you through my thought process as I analyze the evidence for a historical Jesus. I'm going to employ two basic principles while I analyze the evidence. First, I will never pick zero. That means that I will never assume a claim will never happen at all. I think it's possible that Jesus existed in history, but I just don't believe that to be the case. Second, I will only argue from what I feel is the most tenable historicist position there is, and that primarily relies on Paul's information about Jesus. I will not be considering the Gospels as evidence because they derive much of their information from Paul and failed to provide any historical sources for other information. We cannot distinguish between history and legend/myth in these accounts, therefore they are useless in the discussion of history. With these two principles in mind, let's examine the evidence for and against the historical Jesus. When we ask the question, did Jesus exist, we have to consider the prior likelihood that a figure like Jesus is a real historical figure. In describing Jesus, we find that he's part of a class that generally doesn't exist, a savior figure that supposedly died and resurrected to accomplish some goal for his adherents clearly places him in a class that is primarily mythological in nature. Considering this, I give it a low likelihood that Jesus did exist, but that doesn't mean that the evidence can't overcome this prior likelihood. Strong evidence can certainly prove that Jesus existed. But how strong is the evidence? Turns out it's not as strong as some would like you to believe. So, what is the strongest evidence that we have that Jesus existed? The earliest evidence would be Paul's writings about Jesus. That would include at least 7 epistles that are accepted to be written by Paul. And as I stated before, the Gospels appear too late and are tainted by the works of Paul. They are not independent sources as far as we can discern, so they can't really help us. Secular sources are likewise dependent on the Gospels, which are in turn dependent on Paul's work. And we can obviously get into that a lot more. Just to remind everybody, this opening statement's not meant to rebut anything that Jay said in his opening. This is just what I've already pre-written for this opening statement. So it seems like the only good source that we have for this Jesus person existing is the works of a man having hallucinatory visions of a person that supposedly died for the sins of the Jewish people. That still doesn't mean that he can't give us good historical information about this Jesus person. But does Paul say anything that would separate himself from any historical sourcing? Yes, he does. If we look to Galatians 1:11, Paul says this, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel." So it seems like Paul has separated himself from any historical sourcing at all. In fact, it would be antithetical to his entire message if he had sourced his information from historical people. At every chance, Paul makes sure to let people know that he got his information directly from Jesus through a vision. Through a vision or through the scriptures. That's the only way he could be considered an apostle by the other apostles. Any speculation about Paul getting historical information from Cephas or Cephas, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, I guess, or James is unsupported by the text that we have. To suggest that Paul got his information from a historical source is to directly contradict what Paul tells us. But let's assume that Paul didn't tell us everything and that he got some of his historical information from people that knew Jesus. Paul doesn't identify anyone as a disciple of Jesus or even knew Jesus, but still, let's assume that he did get some historical information about him. How might this present in Paul's text? We should expect to see passing references that solidly place Jesus on earth. The problem with that is they don't exist. Starting with what I consider to be the strongest connection between Paul and a historical Jesus has to be the possible historical Jesus reference in Galatians 1:19, where it says, "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." This reference is ambiguous because the word used here for brother, adelphos, can equally be used to reference a fraternal brother. Romans 6:3-10 and Romans 8:29 establishes that Paul considers all baptized Christians to be the brothers and sisters of Jesus, or the Lord, as he would say. Any suggestion that the natural reading of this line must be a blood relative is purely speculative, especially when you consider that every other use of this word by Paul is referencing fictive kinship relations. In Galatians 1:11, he uses adelphos to call every baptized Christian a brother/sister. 2 Corinthians 2:13 has Paul calling Titus his brother, even though they are not blood relatives. There is one good example that showcases the problem with considering adelphos to only ever be used in a blood relation way, and that would be 1 Corinthians 9:5, where he says, "Do not we have the right to take along a believing wife or sister, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" This particular verse is peculiar if you think that the brothers of the Lord to be a blood relation reference. This is due to the mention of the sister or believing wife in the first part of the verse. If the brothers of the Lord reference means a blood relation, then the reference to the sisters also has to be a blood relation, meaning the apostles heavily practice incest. Considering that there are no other clarifying phrases about what kind of sister they are, it seems like it's more like a fictive kinship when he's referencing these believing wives. It becomes arbitrary and speculative to suggest that the brother of the Lord title only ever means a blood relation when all the other evidence to the contrary, when all the other evidence is contrary to that idea. The next strongest piece of evidence from Paul comes from Galatians 4:4, where Paul claims that Jesus was born of a woman. But one thing that casts doubt on this is that it is contained within an allegory. Paul explicitly states that it is an allegory in Galatians 4:24. The purpose of this allegory is to explain how the sacrifice of Jesus absolves our sins. Another problem with considering this reference to be about a human birth is that the Greek word used for birth, genomai, is different from other obvious references to human birth, like genao. The only time Paul uses genomai when discussing birth is with Jesus, and it's used to mean made or manufactured. Genomai is an ambiguous word to use for birth. Romans 9:11 has Paul referencing a human birth. Though they were not yet born, genao, and had done nothing either good or bad. Same with Galatians 4:23. But the son of the slave was born, genao, according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through the promise. And Galatians 4:29, where he says, "But just as that time he who was born, genao, according to the flesh." Genao is a more explicit call to being born or giving birth, which he does in that same allegory in Galatians, but strangely not about Jesus, but about other people. To determine what would be a natural definition for Paul, we must ask how Paul uses the word in general. In 1 Corinthians 15:37, Paul is seen talking about our future resurrection bodies using the same root word. So 1 Corinthians 15:37 says, "And what you sow is not the body that is to be, genomai, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain." Our future resurrection bodies are not born of a woman, but constructed or made of flesh. In 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul says Adam was made using the same root word that he does for Jesus. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became, or genomai, a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. How can Paul use the same word for both Adam and our future resurrection bodies as he does for Jesus's birth? Does it not matter how Paul uses words across his writings? I think it does. Everything about Paul says that he didn't consider Jesus to be literally born of a woman, but his body was manufactured using the seed of David somehow so that he had Jewish flesh. The counter arguments against these portions of Paul are all speculative and arbitrary. They don't have any evidence behind them other than just claiming it has to be this way or it's the natural reading. It doesn't seem like it would be a natural reading to Paul. It seems like the natural reading for Paul is a fictive kinship with other Christians and that Jesus had a manufactured body. So what are we left with as far as Paul goes? We have a man suffering from hallucinations from a savior figure named Jesus Christ. This Jesus was never born and had a body made of Davidic flesh that died and resurrected. There is no historical source mentioned that places this figure on earth. Other portions of Paul suggest that Satan and his demons are the ones that killed Jesus, or the archons of this aeon killed Jesus. We can discuss these later if need be, but Paul's evidence seems to only ever point to a celestial Christ that only ever visited people through visions and an intense reading of the scriptures. The most parsimonious conclusion, given the evidence, is that Jesus probably didn't exist. Nothing mentioned here affects my prior probability that he likely was never a real person. That's the end of my opening statement. So I will leave my notes for the response section, and I eagerly await Jay's response.
Okay. Yeah, you had 2 minutes left, and that's fine. Let's see. So that concludes the opening statements, and then now we're going to do 10-minute rebuttals each, and we'll have CJ go first. And I'll start the timer upon your first word.
Alrighty, and I appreciate that. All right, so now obviously, as Godless was already talking about, this is now the portion for the responses, right? So I do just want to make sure that everybody is, clear on that kind of stuff, because I know a lot of people will talk about, well, you didn't address the kind of stuff that he was talking about. Well, he didn't have to yet, right? That's what we get the next 10 minutes for. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump right into this. So I want to address what he actually said first, but I want to just preface this by saying, and we'll get more into this towards the end of my rebuttal, I wholeheartedly would reject the notion that Paul is earliest. That puts me in a minority, but one of the things that's very convenient in this particular debate is I happen to be in just as small of a minority on this issue as the mythicists are on their issues. That kind of makes, in a way, me and Godless birds of a feather. Ha ha, nudge, nudge. But nonetheless, so going with this kind of stuff, we are talking about whether or not Paul would actually have, because assuming he is the earliest reference, right, whether or not he has anything that actually would clearly demonstrate the existence of a historical Jesus in his writings, right? And there are a couple things that I think are very important to point out here. So first off, it is important that some of the obviousness behind Paul's real life Jesus, actually existing fleshly Jesus, is even kind of already accepted by Godless. For example, Godless said that he was manufactured using the seed of David somehow. In other words, it does still seem like Paul has this notion of a real life fleshly Jesus that existed on this earth. It's just that this real life fleshly Jesus, according to this interpretation at least, is somehow a little bit more divine, or maybe a little bit less terrestrial would be the way to put it, than the Jesus that we commonly accept as the Jesus of Nazareth of Christianity, right? That very notion of somehow being manufactured using the seed of David, well, the seed of David is a seed of an actual lineage, right? David was a real king, Hezekiah after him, and so on and so forth were real kings. And Paul at least does seem to be under the persuasion that Jesus is somehow descendant in some way from this real king, even on Godless Engineer's own, presentation of the information here. So I think that's important to point out, because what it demonstrates for us is that Paul definitely, according to both of us, is convinced of a fleshly Jesus's existence in some way, right? It may not be the same way that I'm saying, but he does believe there was a person called Jesus who existed before him who was actually on the planet, which in the end is kind of what we're talking about here, right? The other thing that I want to point out is, so when we talk about things like, for example, Galatians 1:19, talking about the Lord's brother, and we get this notion that it's very ambiguous, right? From the mythicist. I definitely would not accept that for a couple of reasons. The first and most important reason is this exact title, the brother of the Lord, is not actually given to anybody else with the exception of James, right? Now, there is the 1 Corinthians 9:5 thing that we need to discuss here in a moment, but we'll just pause on that for a second, because I'm about to make the case that I think that that is actually also, in this particular instance, referencing people who were fleshly related to Jesus, because according to the church tradition, at least two of them did actually manage to be church teachers later on, one of them being a disciple of his. But regardless, let's look at as far as a figure who is named and then also labeled after the fact with this brother of Jesus kind of thing. We have Peter, never. John, never. Lazarus, never. All these other figures never actually being referenced as the brother of the Lord, the brother of Jesus, the brother of Christ, anything of that nature. Now, there is the usage like we see in modern day churches, brothers and sisters, brothers in the Lord, things like that, when Paul is talking about a collective body, or he'll identify this person as a brother, this person as a sister in that kind of sense. But with as far as the title, brother of the Lord, not brother of me, Paul, brother of the Lord, brother of Jesus, that kind of stuff, that is not actually found anywhere else with the exception of him saying James is the brother of the Lord, and then the reference here in 1 Corinthians 9:5 to brothers of the Lord. Now let's get to that reference though in 1 Corinthians 9:5, because if you notice in 1 Corinthians 9:5, he is talking about not just the Christians in general, right? But also is talking about apostles here, right? So we see, and let me go ahead and pull up the verse here, but he says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife, which is the word, I don't remember exactly what the Greek is, but it's sister is in the Greek, just as you had said, along with us, as do other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas, right? So it is true here, we see the usage of the word sister to describe one who believes, right? But it is also true that in this passage, Paul is talking about a specific group of people, the Lord's brothers, and also Cephas, who seems to be demonstrated everywhere else to be this Peter character. I know that's something that's probably going to come into dispute in our conversation for other reasons, but nonetheless, you guys, if you are familiar with the other works of the New Testament, know that Cephas is identified elsewhere as Peter, right? So it could be, you could interpret this, in other words, as saying that these people who are indeed Christians are brothers of the Lord. It is also equally possible, and I would say more possible considering the exclusivity of this term in relation to James, not being given to Peter and so on and so forth, that this is actually in reference to apostles and also those who were brothers of Jesus, because it's said in Mark that he had 4, and also to Cephas himself, who seems to have very early on taken a very particular role of leadership. I don't want to say too much because I'm obviously not a Catholic, but it does seem that he was a little bit higher in regard. And of course, that's demonstrated in the book of Acts and Galatians as well, where he's called something like a pillar of the church, right? We also have the reference of being born of a woman. And he says here that this is something that is allegorically used to refer to our spiritual bodies. But I would just point out, it is the interpretation of virtually all Christians of the last 2,000 years, though admittedly not every single one, not every single sect, right? That our spiritual birth in heaven is actually also a physical birth. In other words, Christians do expect to literally live on a literal new earth. So while it is true that Paul is talking about a spiritual birth in this aspect, it is also true that he's talking about a physical birth in this aspect. He expects to live again in a real life functioning planet with real life functioning humans. Excuse me, not just like ambiguous spirits or anything along those lines. I would also point out that for me personally, I don't actually think this is the best evidence that Paul himself gives for a historically existing Jesus. For example, 1 Corinthians 15, I think, is a much better example when it says, "For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures, a non-living, non-fleshly being, of course, cannot die, that he was buried, that he was a buried being, that implies something that's physical on this planet, that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas," again, elsewhere that's demonstrated to be Peter, and then to the 12, other areas of the New Testament refer to these 12 as being the disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. That is obviously something that is a spiritual apparition, but it does appear elsewhere that when Jesus rises, he rises physically. And we did see here in verse 4 that he was raised on the third day. That does seem to imply a physical resurrection, not just simply a spiritual resurrection, because all the Jews expect to have a spiritual resurrection, right? That's one of the core tenets of at least the Pharisees at that particular time, as well as the Essenes and some other groups. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. In my opinion, this is clear as day, saying that this man did actually exist. He was physically, on this planet, died, and was risen from the dead in a physical way. So whether or not you believe the resurrection, of course, that's not relevant. Paul does. Paul believes an actual human being rose from the dead, and that human being was Jesus, right? And so, yeah, I'll just kind of, instead of being a dead horse, I'll just go ahead and.
You have 1 minute.
There.
1 minute.
I appreciate that. So let me go ahead then and turn from there and just say briefly, then all of this, in my opinion, isn't even actually relevant, because I don't think Paul was actually first. I think that is something that is, a lot of people believe that in the modern day, but it's very new. The most recent, the latest, earliest, oh man, I cannot use my words today. The earliest theories that would say that Paul was writing, writing the first epistles, writing the first books of the New Testament, saying that the apostles didn't actually write anything, saying that there were no eyewitnesses, come from the late 1700s, early 1800s. Before then, it was unanimous amongst everybody who was actually closest to this, as well as everybody after the fact, that Matthew actually did write Matthew, that Mark actually did write Mark, that James actually did write James. And so I think that it actually has to be demonstrated for us that these are not eyewitnesses. Now, that's not exclusively the argument, so that's not the only thing we're going to be talking about here today, but it's something that I think is important to note, because if indeed it is true that Matthew was writing within a decade, then the whole thing falls apart, and I'll end there.
All right. Thank you. The bells are ringing. All right, Godless, I'll start on your first word.
Okay, so thank you so much there, Jay, for your opening and rebuttal. So I do have a lot of notes here to get into, probably too much to actually make it through this rebuttal period. So I'll do my best to get through it. So starting off at the very beginning with your opening there, you list the biblical evidence, as something that convinces you that Jesus existed, or being some evidence that proves Jesus existed. All of the documents being penned before 100 AD is actually not true, because definitely the Gospel of John is a second century document, and then there are other documents that were forged and written well into the second century. So not all of the documents are penned before 100 AD. Although I will say that some of the most important documents in there that you could use were penned before 100 AD. Just a little nitpicky thing. Nobody's identified as an eyewitness to anything that Jesus did while on earth. Not even Paul talks about anything that was that actually occurred to Jesus or by Jesus on earth. I know some people will say that Paul talks about the Last Supper, but in fact, because Paul's saying that he got all of his information about Jesus directly from visions of Jesus or through the scriptures, then he most likely got it through a vision of Jesus. And so that it wasn't a recount of something that historically happened. It was a recount of some vision that he had, or maybe something that he read out of the scriptures. We're not exactly sure. There's actually no scriptural support whatsoever in any of Paul's epistles about Paul meeting disciples. That is kind of sort of anachronistic. I mean, granted, these people like Peter and James could have been James the Pillar specifically. They could have been disciples, but we have no indication in any kind of written source anywhere that they were disciples, at least not until the Gospels, and those are definitely written after Paul. The scholarship on the connection between Mark's Gospel and Paul, and Mark's Gospel being written between 65 and just after 70. There's strong evidence there if you really want to get into the scholarship on it. I mean, that's the majority position for a reason, because the evidence is good, not just because everybody agrees about it. And then saying that the Gospels are written by disciples, eyewitnesses, and then not necessarily the Gospels, but early church historians were writing things historically about Jesus. All of that is incorrect. We don't have any writings from disciples. Nobody is identified as an eyewitness whatsoever. And the early church fathers, which I guess are the historians that you're talking about, which would be like, Justin Martyr or Papias or maybe Papias, I don't know. But none of them were actually concerned at all with history. In fact, Justin Martyr is known to have explicitly said that he didn't care about the historical nature of Christianity. All he did was read it and he believed it. Like, he just read the Gospels and he believed it. So that's in Justin Martyr's work, which we'll get into here in a minute. And then Revelation was not written in 95. Revelation is definitely a 2nd century document. There's multiple reasons for that. Typically, the text of Revelation puts it fitting better with events that were happening in the 2nd century rather than in the 1st century. And then the Gospels being written before Josephus, and saying most scholars agree about this. I would really like to see some citations on this. And I mean, I don't expect you to give citations like tonight about that. I can't give you citations for some of the things that I haven't prepared for here, but the Gospels being written before Josephus, I would just really need to see the information on that, because everything that I've seen from actual scholarship has everybody agreeing for good reason, because of the evidence that the Gospels were definitely written after 70 AD. So that's the first section of evidence. The second section of evidence, extra biblical sources. None of those are good. Like the Epistle of Barnabas. I mean, we can't establish that that's independent or at least has independent information about Jesus or anything like that. Clement of Rome. We can't establish that he was independent of the Gospels or any other early Christian thought about the theological Jesus, not the historical one. Papias is definitely a poor source to use. I would suggest not using Papias. He's regularly regarded as not being reliable in this particular area. Polycarp is also not going to be able to give us any kind of good information on Jesus, because he's definitely tainted by the Gospels and other Christian writings of the 1st century. Justin Martyr, like I said before, does not give us any kind of good information about a historical Jesus, because he didn't care about a historical Jesus. Like, he never mentions anything. And in fact, in one section of Justin Martyr, he says that the things that are said about Jesus are the exact same things that are said about like the sons of Zeus or the sons of thunder or whatever. So he makes a direct comparison between their ideas of Jesus and these other pagan gods, and saying that they're not really any different. They're just Christian instead of pagan. Moving on to the next section, extra biblical non-Christian sources, Josephus and his references. I don't think that Josephus references Jesus at all. How much time do I have, by the way?
Jamie? I don't know if you're on mute, Jamie. I don't know if you can. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on. Just keep going.
Sorry, I wait for just a moment. Were you done?
No. I just didn't know how much time I had left.
Oh, you have. Sorry about that, man. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, good.
No, I'll add 30 for you too.
Okay. Extra biblical non-Christian evidence. So the Josephus references. Testimonium Flavianum has a lot of problems with it. For one thing, it's not just mythicists that reject the Testimonium Flavianum. There's plenty of people out there that are non-mythicists that reject the Testimonium as being authentic to Josephus. Like you got Paul Hopper, who did a textual analysis on it, and he identified that like verb phrases are different in the Testimonium than Josephus uses it. The story is structured differently. And in fact, other scholars had pointed out how that the Testimonium Flavianum was actually modeled off the Emmaus Road story from Luke. And there's several other reasons. I've got a whole clip on it on my Godless Engineer Shorts channel that explains in detail why it's not a true reference to Jesus. And then the James reference, most likely this James is actually James ben Damnius. This is due to the fact that later on in that particular passage, it talks about Jesus ben Damnius being put into the position that James was killed. Like James was in a position, he was killed, and then they filled that position with Jesus ben Damnius, and this is generally what happens with like family members and stuff. Plus, the who was called Christ that appears earlier in that passage looks more like a marginal note than anything else. If you replace that with ben Damnius or something referencing Jesus ben Damnius, then you're going to see that it'll flow seamlessly. It'll be fine. And this is using the typical indicators that we get for interpolations that's used elsewhere in history. And then there's the whole brother of Jesus thing in the Galatians 1:19, which I know you mentioned later, but I had it down here. Then I do want to get to Tacitus. Even Robert Van Voorst doesn't agree that Tacitus is independent in his Jesus Outside the New Testament. He clearly states that both him and R.T. France agree that you can't establish that Tacitus is independent of the Gospels. So that's definitely a bunk source. The Talmud actually talks about a Jesus under King Janaeus right around 80 BCE. And he was, there's a lot of differences between that Jesus and the Jesus of Christianity. For one thing, that Jesus was stoned as well as his disciples were killed. Got it. And it also takes place in a completely different area, completely different time period. So that seems like a bunk source as well. And then we got the existence of Christianity in general. I think this is probably your weakest point out of all of them. Just because I think that just because a belief arose does not mean that belief is historical. Just because Paul, later became Christian instead of starting Christianity, I don't think that proves anything either. And then you talked about, and you further elaborated in the next section with the ambiguous reference to the 12 and the Pauline Creed. You kind of speculated that they were disciples. There's nothing that indicates that these are disciples. Paul never mentions anybody being a disciple. We don't know who these 12 were. They could be disciples, but it's also likely that it was just some other kind of reference. It could be a metaphorical reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. Could have been a reference to a different set of 12 people completely. But the thing is that we just don't know. We're not given any kind of indication of it. And I guess I'll just I'll leave it at that. Good.
Perfect.
Boom.
All right. You're on mute, Jamie.
Thanks. That'll conclude the rebuttal period, and now we're going to open it up to open conversation. So have at it, guys. I'll moderate if anybody gets too unruly, and I will slap you around a little bit.
Do it. Jay, since I just spoke for like 10 minutes, I'm gonna, maybe something I said really hit you wrong. So I'll let you go first.
So I think the first thing that would probably be important, because it's probably a fundamental hinge on which each of our arguments would be based, right, is this dating question, right? I'll work my way down to my very fundamentalist view of incredibly early dates and start at the front of the problem here. So you would probably take the position that obviously that all of them were written post 70, like most modern consensus scholars. And you said you think that John is a 2nd century document. Do you think any other gospels are 2nd century?
I mean, none that are canon or in the biblical like narrative. I think that, well, I mean, as far as the Gospels go, I think that John's written in the 2nd century. I think Luke is definitely written after 93 CE. So, I mean, I guess it's possible that he could have been written in the 2nd century. But if you push Luke into the 2nd century, then you're also pushing John further into the 2nd century. And I really don't think there's too much room for you to push right there. But it could be that could be the case. So as far as other documents that are in the Bible in general, I can't recall like when 2 Peter or 1 Peter was written, but certainly I would say most of the documents were written before 100 AD. There's just a few in there that are definitely 2nd century in my view.
So, well, I'll address the Luke one a little bit separately just to get more specific with each source. So I know there are some scholars, typically very skeptical scholars, which I don't think that that's important for any other reason other than for the same reason it's important to note why I think Matthew was written very early, right? Those kinds of biases do end up being important sometimes. But nonetheless, when you look at, so I could actually name 2 specific references as far as John being written before 100. Or at least bare minimum, very, very, I guess, in the case of when Andrew Lincoln has said it could have been written as late as the very early 100s, so that could go into the 2nd century, but he tends to put it around 90 to 100. And Bart Ehrman also places it typically around 90 to 100 as far as the Gospel of John. And as far as the Gospel of Luke, which would be then separate, the latest that I typically hear from that outside of scholars who are in some way polemic against Christianity is about 85. Which is about 8 years prior to Antiquities of the Jews. And I assume that's why you chose 93, right? Because Antiquities of the Jews is... well,
yeah, because there's a lot of evidence that connects that Josephus's work in 93 to Luke. And we know that it's Luke that copied off of Josephus for, like several reasons. So
what are some of those reasons, though? Because I would personally argue that I think it's much more likely that, if anything, Josephus might have been copying Luke. It does seem like most of our evidence demonstrates Luke is an earlier source. It also seems to be the case that a lot of the things that we look at as far as being evidence that Luke got something wrong, like, for example, when he places the census of Quinius or something like that. He places it at a different time than Josephus. It's almost like there's an assumption made Josephus has to be right and Luke wrong. But if Luke is actually an earlier source, there's no reason to assume that. So my question would just be, why make the assumption that Luke is copying one or the other and not the other way around?
Well, Luke gets a lot of his information from several sources. I mean, there's evidence of Homer, the Odyssey and Iliad in Luke. But, I guess the main place would be that, Luke, we have solid evidence that says that Luke copied from Matthew. Matthew writing in the 80s. I think that Luke writing in 85. Like, if Matthew would have had to have written in like the late 70s, early 80s in order for Luke, to copy off of him, I would think by 85. But the thing that places Luke in after 93 CE is the fact that Luke Luke gets the same things wrong that Josephus does in the exact same order. And unless you're going to say that somehow Josephus copied from Luke, didn't tell us that he was copying from Luke, where he otherwise lets us know, what his sources are, in a way that historians actually let us know. Unless you're gonna say that, then I don't really see what evidence that you got. Like for instance, we both agree that Luke also wrote Acts, right?
Yeah.
And I do believe that it's Acts that mentions the other, failed messiahs and whatnot. I do believe. And, Luke mentions the same messiahs in the exact same order and everything like that. But also another connection is that Luke mentions certain geographical places that are not representative of their actual geographic locations in the exact same way that Josephus does. Now, I'll admit that I haven't researched that particular connection as well as I've researched other connections, but to me, the evidence seems to be rather damning for Luke to be using Josephus.
Well, I think there's a couple
right.
things. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so there would be a couple things that for me would be important to note. The first thing is that there are, I think, some very important differences. In fact, there are differences that for a lot of people are used to call into question the Gospel of Luke, right? And the quintessential example is the census. It seems like, according to Josephus, this census that Luke references in Luke chapter 1 that causes everybody to go home and all that. This takes place something like 10 years after it's supposed, according to Josephus, it takes place like 10 years after Luke is placing it, right? Because Luke is placing it around the time of Herod's reign. Herod is supposed to die around 4 BC, and this is supposed to have happened around 6 AD. That's a direct contradiction between Luke and Josephus that, in my opinion, is either one of the two being incorrect or referencing two completely different censuses, right? Now, if it's the case that one of the two is incorrect... Sorry.
Well, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I feel like you're being very speculative about when Luke places the census occurring, because you say that he places it during the time of Herod, but the only way that you can get that is if you also accept the Matthew's infancy infancy narrative, and both of those accounts are diametrically opposed to one another. They're totally different. And so I don't understand why you think that Luke places it in the time of Herod rather than in the time of Quirinius.
Well, so there's a couple of things I would say. The first thing is, I think we would probably agree that Matthew is used as a source by Luke. I personally believe that when Luke says in the beginning that in Luke chapter 1, that he was talking to different eyewitnesses and stuff like that. I think that is in his way, he doesn't specifically say the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, but if we are in agreement that those were written before and were circulated before Luke was written, then I think that ends up being a somewhat implicit acceptance on Luke's part that he is using these sources as well as other sources. So I have no problem with saying that Luke was using Matthew as a source or Mark as a source. And if we would agree on that, then that's at least one reason to assume that he is placing this in Herod's reign. He does refer to Herod, and he elsewhere refers to Agrippa by the name Agrippa, not by the name Herod. In other words, it seems like he's using Herod to refer to Herod the Great, and Agrippa to refer to Herod Agrippa, the later potential Herod that would be around at the time of Quirinius.
Yeah, but by the way,
this
speculative.
Has been a commonly accepted position as well. Go ahead.
Huh?
I was just going to say this has been the commonly accepted position amongst historians, because most historians think that Luke got this wrong. They think that he actually misplaced this particular. I would take a minority position that says Luke, being an earlier source, is probably more trustworthy than Josephus, which you probably have heard a lot about by Michael Jones. You just kind of talked a little bit about it. But regardless, the point here just kind of being that this argument, which is typically an argument used against the Gospels, is very generally accepted as far as people saying that Luke is placing the census of Quirinius in the time of Herod the Great's reign.
Well, no, I mean, so I was going to mention something. I mean, you're being very speculative about all this, the idea that when Luke says Herod, he means Herod the Great. There's nothing that indicates that. And also, he was mentioning Herod the Great. That doesn't make sense because Quirinius wasn't the governor of Syria during the time of Herod the Great's reign. Like, he was in a totally different area of the world at that time. So it doesn't make any kind of sense.
To see, but that's actually part of the argument. Again, that's what part of the argument a lot of people tend to use against the Gospel of Luke's historicity, right? Is they say that he biffed this particular historical moment. And what I'm saying is I think the fact that there is a quote contradiction between where he places this census and where Josephus places this census only demonstrates that Luke biffed, which is what people tend to agree on this, right? If indeed we can take Josephus's word over Luke's, but I don't see any reason why we can take Josephus's word over Luke, especially if we have a scholarly consensus that Luke is before the time of Josephus, which to just
no, there's not a scholarly consensus about that. But there's not a scholarly consensus about that. I mean, you mentioned two people. I mean, the rest of the scholarship that I've looked at and that I've seen referenced has all placed it after Josephus, like at least in the 90s.
No, sorry, I'll interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, another thing I was going to say is that, like, I don't even use Josephus to say that Luke got. For one thing, I don't think that Luke got the date wrong. I think that Luke is refuting what Matthew is saying, and I don't want to get bogged down on the Gospels all that much because I feel like there's better evidence out there for Jesus' existence in the Gospels. But the way that I date Luke's Gospel is just by what he tells me at the very beginning, and that's that he was writing during the time of Quirinius. Quirinius wasn't in that particular position that Luke says that he was in until way after Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE. So there's literally no way for this census to happen during Herod the Great's reign when Luke literally tells you, hey, this happened during Quirinius's reign, which makes it 6 AD. So Luke is refuting Matthew's gospel.
So just to be clear then, so you wouldn't say that there's a contradiction between Luke and Josephus, you'd say there's a contradiction between Luke and Matthew. Is that a fair representation of how you would address that point?
Yes.
So real briefly, so first I just want to point out when it came to the two scholars, that was particularly about John. In the case of Luke, there's quite a bit that I think I could reference. Raymond Brown, Ehrman again, Bruce Mesker talks about Luke being written no later than the year 90. And there's other figures that we could mention there as well. Todd Berzon, actually from Columbia University, is another example. So as far as the Luke example is concerned, there's quite a bit of modern, and of course, whether or not it's the consensus isn't necessarily the argument, right? But what I'm saying is, if that is the consensus, then it does seem to me like it now has to be demonstrated that there's actually some kind of reason we take the later source Josephus over the earlier source Luke. And if the only evidence that we have for Luke being the later source is that he quotes Josephus, well, I would just say, well, if we have good evidence to suggest Luke is before Josephus, then that evidence works in reverse just as well. Josephus could be quoting Luke, right? And all of this is just to say, the farther we push back these Gospels, right, the more likely it is, because let's just call a spade a spade. If I'm right and Matthew wrote Matthew in about the year 41, which is what Eusebius and Irenaeus and all these others would have suggested up until the early 1800s, that's roughly a decade before Paul writes anything, and Matthew's claims to be an eyewitness. That would basically end the debate, right? Like if you wrote
Matthew claims to be an eyewitness.
Well, excuse me, let me rephrase that, I guess, because that wouldn't be exactly accurate. Church tradition claims Matthew to be an eyewitness. So I'll put that.
Okay, I don't care about church tradition at all.
See, but that to me seems a little bit dishonest, because that would be, and I don't mean dishonest in the sense that you're lying, but I mean dishonest in the sense that it's probably too biased. Because that would be kind of like me dismissing any evidence that Richard Carrier or Bart Ehrman would put forward because they're atheists. And I don't think that's necessary.
No. I dismiss I dismiss the church tradition, because church tradition isn't based on history or anything that's actually sourced historically. It's all just based on what people say. And so without any kind of historical sourcing to it, I don't care about church tradition whatsoever. I mean, I talked about like Justin Martyr, he just didn't care about the historicity of Christianity or any kind of historical sourcing for Christianity. He just cared about the theological truths that Christianity taught, and that's what convinced him. And so, that's the church tradition that you're talking about here. And so, all of it's just really just based on what these people said was true, or what these people said was the case, and not like actually giving us historical information about it.
See, I think I would just see a couple of issues with that. I think the first problem is when it comes to like, well, this is just people saying things, depending on what exactly you mean by that, that is sort of just what history at this time was. Like, in other words, if you're saying they're not demonstrating like archaeological evidence or something like that, well, right, I guess I agree with you. But if you're saying they're not sourcing, well, Papias and Ignatius and Polycarp are all said to be sourced from John directly. Right. Irenaeus is actually, in fact, Irenaeus writes saying that he is a disciple of Polycarp, who himself is a disciple of John. Right. And so that he's very clearly actually.
But does Polycarp say that he's a disciple of John?
I guess off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure if we have a reference from that. I know that Ignatius does, and I know that Papias does. Polycarp, I'm not. Now, Papias also claims to have spoken to numerous, because Papias is one of the more interesting ones to go into.
Well, so Papias
daughters and go ahead.
Papias sourced his information from a person named the Elder John, which that's the only person that or Papias is the only person that ever claims to have ever met the Elder John. So it's not this Elder John is not the Apostle John or the person that wrote the Gospel of John. This is just for all that we can tell, somebody that Papias made up in order to make his information look like it comes from a direct source. So you don't actually have anybody that got their information directly from an apostle or a disciple whatsoever.
That seems to me like a little bit of begging the question, though, because to say that we don't have any evidence of this, this person John, it's not the apostle, but we know that it's so. In other words, we know it's not the apostle and that Papias made it up because there's no other reference to this John. But that only is true if you say that we don't know who this is and Papias made it up, right? In other words, if it's true that John the Elder and John of Patmos, John the Apostle, because he calls him John of Patmos, and that's the link, right? If it's true that John the Elder and John the Apostle are the same person, then it's no longer true that Papias made all of this up. You see what I'm saying? And so, and it makes sense.
Yeah, but that's just whataboutism.
I don't say it's whataboutism. What I think is what we have demonstrated here, right, is there's an assumption, I think, being made that Papias made this up, when in reality, we do have to demonstrate that, right? It seems
so Papias makes up a number of other things. Papias makes up and lies about a number of other things, like the death of Judas Iscariot. He makes that up. But something directly connected to this Elder John, he says that he got from Elder John that I believe Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, which is not true at all. So all the even if the Elder John was like a real person that wasn't just made up by Papias, it's fairly obvious that this Elder John had no connection to an apostle or to a disciple or anything like that, just because of how much information Papias gets wrong. And I mean, this is coming from people like Bart Ehrman and other skeptical or non-religious scholars, I guess, if people need that. But the fact is that Papias gets so much information wrong. There's no reason for us to think that this Elder John actually had any real connection to anybody that actually knew Jesus or was an apostle whatsoever. And Polycarp never mentions anywhere in any of the writings that we have from him that he was a disciple of John. That's again speculation made by Ignatius later on in what was Ignatius, like either the end of the second
Irenaeus.
century or the beginning of the third, or Irenaeus, sorry, not Ignatius, Irenaeus.
Well, so I think there's just a lot of problems that kind of just arise with this interpretation, right? So first off, as far as the things Papias gets wrong, definitively, in other words, without dispute, there's only one thing that Papias gets wrong, which is something you already mentioned, the death of Judas. There is scholars, they're fringe, admittedly, but we're both on the fringes here, so I don't think we can necessarily hate people for being fringe, right? Not literal hate, but you know what I mean, chastise, so to speak. Because there are some scholars out there, like, for example, something Black, I can't remember his name, but he's also the guy who puts forward Matthean priority. It'll come to me here in the middle of this, but Dr. Black. And there's a couple others as well who have actually put forward this idea that Matthew actually was probably originally written in the Hebrew tongue. Now, the Hebrew tongue at the time, which Papias would probably not have known, would have been Aramaic and not Hebrew. And so when he's saying it's the Hebrew tongue, it to us sounds like he's saying it's Hebrew, but in reality, he's saying the tongue which the Hebrews spoke in, which in his time would have been Aramaic. And so there is a little bit of, I guess you could say, nuance there. But there are another, just to make the point, scholars who do try to make the argument, and I think successfully, that Matthew probably was actually originally written in a Hebraic tongue. In fact, it seems to fit with all of the rest of the church tradition, because if he wrote first and he was a disciple, which is the claims, of course, that we have throughout the first 1,800 years of church history, and if it's also true that he was very focused on the the prophecies and the Torah and the Mosaic connection and all that stuff, which is universally agreed upon by skeptics and Christians alike, right? Matthew's a very Hebraic gospel. Then it would make perfect sense that he was writing this in the, originally at least, in the tongue that the Hebrews would be understanding, or in the style that the Hebrews would be writing it. Now, as far as I think it's Arthur David Black, if I'm remembering correctly, that might be it. But I could be wrong about that. I'm kind of foggy on what his actual name is. Nonetheless, so the only thing he definitively gets wrong is one detail about Judas's death, right? And as far as that's concerned, I'm fine to say Papias can get details wrong. I don't have any problem with that, right? Because everybody gets something wrong. So I just don't think that that's necessarily an argument that he can't be trusted. And as far as like the hearsay when it comes to Polycarp, well, the only way for Polycarp to be not a disciple of John is to now claim yet another person is lying, which is Irenaeus, because Irenaeus is, according to his own admission, a pupil of Polycarp, and he says that Polycarp is a pupil of John. So, and this is much in the same way that we would say, like, the only way for certain facts about Aristotle to be, or excuse me, about Socrates to be wrong is if Plato is lying, right? That's possible, but let's just be clear about what's being claimed. You know what I mean?
Well, no, actually, what I said was that Polycarp doesn't ever claim it. All we get is a what was it? Late second or early third, Irenaeus, third century person that just says that he was. So we don't actually have anything that directly connects him. We just have like a friend of a friend or something that's saying, oh yeah, he definitely was under the Apostle John. And so I mean, I don't know if he was lying or not, but what I do know is that we do not have Polycarp, who had multiple chances in order to tell us that he was a student of the Apostle John, never tells us that he was the student of the Apostle John. So it seems to me like you're just assuming that Polycarp isn't lying and that he's always telling us the truth, and that he somehow has this direct knowledge in one way or another. And it's kind of weird that Polycarp doesn't tell us, and that we only hear it from Irenaeus. So I'm just very hesitant to say, hey, this Polycarp was a disciple of John or was a student of John's, when we don't actually have any solid evidence that he was. So that's what prevents me from accepting that.
Well,
6 minutes left.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying we got 6 minutes left for the half hour, or we can extend it if you want, but just giving you a heads up.
Go ahead.
No.
Put in their opinion. I'm fine.
I might have to leave at 8 is my only issue, but I can try to get that extended. But don't worry, just go ahead and keep going, and we can keep going.
Yeah, I'm fine with whatever we got to do a hard stop to move to the make sure everybody's accounted for and all that. I'm fine with, but
yeah, you can go another 10 minutes at least. So
for sure. So
okay, can maybe we talk about you saying that the 1 Corinthians 15 is the best evidence for a historical Jesus?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so my problem with this, and this is one of the points that I didn't get to in either or in my rebuttal, but it's very weird to me that the Pauline Creed says that all of that happened according to the scriptures, and then the only time Jesus appeared to anybody was after he resurrected. That seems rather weird. So, like, when I read 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, what I read is that Paul got the death, burial, and resurrection from the scriptures, and that's the only place that he got it from.
Well, so I think there's a couple things that I would point out there. The first and most important just kind of being that but I don't know that it would be necessary for him to say that Jesus was appearing or anything like that if he hadn't resurrected, only because I think the assumption now, of course, this does assume that Paul is talking about a physical Jesus. So I'll grant that for a moment. But if he is talking about a physical Jesus, he doesn't have to appear before he resurrects because he's already here, right? In other words, I wouldn't appear to you right now in the way that I appear after I could potentially rise from the dead, or if I was an apparition or a ghost, because I'm an actual, living person right now. And so me and you were just having a normal conversation. You see what I mean? So in that sense, I think it might just be perhaps looking for a little bit too much out of this particular verse. The other thing I would kind of point out too, no. What do you think about that first? Let's not get, because I want to make sure we have good dialogue. So, just what do you think about that particular statement first?
I'm sorry, I kind of got distracted. Can you kind of summarize what you were talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So I don't think it's necessary for Paul to reference the appearance of Jesus before his resurrection, if indeed he is talking about a physical resurrection. Because just like if God forbid, but if I happen to pass away very soon, right, and then I appeared to you as a ghost, right, that wouldn't be the same as what's going on right now, right? Right now we're having a face-to-face conversation as living, fleshly human beings, and if I appeared to you as some kind of apparition later on, that would be a fundamentally different experience for the godless engineer than what's going on presently, right? And so when I think when he's saying appearing, the assumption, at least to me, seems like he's talking about a physical person who now has risen from the dead, and therefore the usage of the word appearing, where it wouldn't necessarily be used beforehand. Does that make sense?
What particular part of the Pauline Creed indicates that it was somehow like physical in nature and not celestial?
Well, I would argue that I think that the celestial concept has to be read into, Paul's works. So lack of context would be my first point. But then my second point would be that I would say resurrection itself, I think, implies physical resurrection, because the idea behind a resurrection is, and in fact, this is what Paul himself expects for himself, right? The idea of this resurrection is that you were at one point alive physically and fleshly, and then you rise up with this new glorified spiritual body. And Paul even directly says that this is like a typology for Christians, right? That we expect to be risen in the same way that Jesus, who was the first fruits, was risen. If that's true, we're all, of course, the assumption is that we're all physical, fleshly humans. And so I think we would have to assume that Paul is also assuming Jesus was a physical and fleshly human.
Well, so I do agree with you that I think that Paul thought that Jesus had flesh and blood. But the problem is that this whole concept of what is celestial. And I think that just because Jesus was flesh and blood does not, as far as like the Jewish concept of what it means to be celestial. I feel like Paul thought of Jesus as being this physical thing, but he was also celestial in that he appears to people. Like I mean, he's still like he phases in and out, and you see this all throughout the Gospels and Paul's work. When Paul has these hallucinatory visions, he thinks that Jesus has a fleshly body, but it still doesn't make it real. Like, it doesn't make it like an actual like earthly human being appearing before you. It's still like Jesus just appearing out of nowhere. That's spirit. That's spiritual. Even if it's in physical, according to Paul in that way, it's still celestial because of how the Jews thought of the celestial realm, being that the celestial realm is right on top of the firmament. It's a physical place that you can go there. That's why you have like the tower of Babel. They were trying to build a tower up to the firmament because that's where God resided. So I mean, the celestial realm was a physical place, just like Sheol was a physical place that if you wanted to, you could conceivably go there. And so I don't think that necessarily means that Jesus was physically here on earth after he died. I think that that's what Paul experienced in hallucinatory visions, but that doesn't like you do have to read into Paul that that's what he meant. And I don't feel like that's a very good way to read Paul. I think the good way to read Paul is to take him at his word when he says that according to the scriptures, Jesus died, was buried, and resurrected, and then appeared to people in a celestial manner. Which while maybe it was flesh and blood to him, that does not mean that Jesus was a historical figure.
Well, so I think there's an important thing that we need to account for here, though, right? Is everything that we're talking about, appearances, the celestial, going down to Sheol, all that kind of stuff. It's not even necessarily that I disagree with what you're saying as far as these places are described as physical and stuff like that, right? I certainly do agree. But it's the fact that the concept of resurrection, right, of dying and rising on the third day, that is now you have a different element here of the appearance is after death, right? The Sheol is after death. The going to the third heaven, all that's all after death, all the spiritual stuff. But the death itself and then the resurrecting that leads to this appearance in the first place, that's not just fleshly, but terrestrial, right? That's an earthly thing. And again, Paul uses it.
I don't think that that's found anywhere in Paul whatsoever, that it was that. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul specifically says that it's only according to the scriptures that he knows that these things happen. So he knows that Jesus died, buried, and resurrected only ever due to reading the scriptures.
See, I think that's a little bit of a misreading, though, there, because it's not when somebody is saying according to the scriptures, right? It's kind of like when Jesus says, "As it is written," right? Or you have heard when he's talking in Matthew 5, right? You have been told all this kind of stuff. These kinds of things. What he's trying to say is this was prophesied in the scriptures and then took place, not that this was something we only learned from the scriptures, right? It's kind of similar to how when Matthew says, as it is written, my son I have brought out of Egypt, and he's referencing Hosea 11:1, right?
But Jay, that's totally antithetical to Paul's entire message.
I don't think I agree with that, though. I think that's something that has to be kind of read in using this understanding of much.
No, it doesn't have to be read. It doesn't have to be read into anything. Paul specifically states that he only gets his information about Jesus either from a vision of Jesus or from reading the scriptures. Those are the only two places. So you literally don't have to read any kind of meaning into Paul. You just have to literally read the words that are in the book.
Well, that is a little bit of a different claim, though, right? Because it's one thing to say, I only got my information from Jesus about the scriptures. But it's another thing to say, hey, this argument that he's actually putting forward here, that Jesus was risen according to the scriptures, is a reference to him only learning about this according to the scriptures. When the other usages that we see of this kind of phraseology is actually trying to say, hey, in fulfillment of these scriptures, in fulfillment of prophecy.
So
that kind of stuff,
then where is Paul lying at? Which one is Paul lying about?
No, I don't think he's lying. I think it's just a misinterpretation as far as what he's saying, right? Because what he's trying to say here in this passage isn't that it's not a question as to how he got the information, right? It's a question as to whether or not the scriptures was being fulfilled in what Jesus was doing. What he's trying to say is, hey, Jesus died and rose again on the third day, just as prophecy originally foretold. He's not necessarily saying this is where I got this information from, right? In fact, if we good.
So either Paul is lying about only ever getting information about Jesus, either from Jesus or from the scriptures, or he's lying in this particular, in my opinion, bad reading of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that it was like in accordance with, or, like it was foretold in the scriptures that he would do these things. Like he's, let's, for the sake of argument, let's assume that that's what he meant. Either Paul is lying right here, or he's lying about only ever getting his information from the scriptures and from visions. It's one of the two. You got to pick one. Because
why would that
cannot be true,
though? Right? Why would that have to be a lie though? Because that would be, to me, it seems like that would kind of be like saying, like if I had said my information that I got about Abraham Lincoln was only from some kind of secondhand source, right? In other words, I'd never written a source from his, or read, a source from his lifetime, right? And then I mentioned something that happened, or that was discovered, that happened to back up what I had read about. Right? How would that be me lying about where I got the information? In other words, let's say that I read about something written in 1980, or something's written in 1988 about Abraham Lincoln. That's the only thing I've ever written about Abraham Lincoln. But something's discovered in 2023 that backs up what was written in 1988, and I mentioned that. That's not contradictory to my statement as far as where I got the information, right? It's just saying, hey, this backed up.
I don't understand. I don't understand how this actually maps to the discussion about Paul.
Because what I'm trying to say is like what he's demonstrating is in this source, or what he's trying to say at least, is this source, these scriptures, in other words, these prophecies were brought to fruition in this event, and this event took place, right? That's what he's trying to say. He's not necessarily making a claim.
That's not what he says.
Hey, I got this information from the Gospels or something like that. He's saying that in fulfillment of Scripture, this is what actually took place. In fact, I would even go as far as to say it only works if he's referencing a already written, at least what he believes to be an already written scripture, right? In other words, his argument here would only make sense under the perspective that he is saying this is brought to fruition, because that seems to be the only point of the argument. If he's saying here, this is where I got the information, then how is it that later on, after this happened according to the scriptures, that he actually gets the information by virtue of a vision? You see what I mean? Like, did he get the information by the scriptures, or did he get the information by the vision? According to this particular passage,
both of those are his sources. So if it wasn't a vision, like for instance, anything that is said to directly come from Jesus would be from a vision. But if it's other information about Jesus or his teaching, then it would be probably from the scriptures. Like I can give you a for instance, like when he talks about the Lord's Supper, that was given to him through a vision of Jesus, where Jesus is telling him about the Lord's Supper and this new this new ritual that you have to go through as a Christian. Whereas when he's talking about how he knows other things, like that he was that he died, that he was buried, and that he resurrected, and then he appeared to people, is because the scriptures say so. So, I mean, to me, look, here's what as far as 1 Corinthians 15 goes, I'm more apt to just take Paul at his word as what he's saying. And what he's saying in 1 Corinthians 15 is that he got this information from the scriptures. And this seems to be very parsimonious with Paul's position on only ever getting his information from either a vision of Jesus or from the scriptures. So it seems to me like reading information into Paul is just a really bad way to interpret this passage.
See, and I guess I would just disagree as far as that being the natural reading. It seems to me like the natural reading here is that he's saying this was in fulfillment of these certain scriptures, and basically saying this is what the scriptures talked about, and Jesus is the one who did this kind of thing. But we are limited on time. So is there anything else I wanted to? I kind of got to everything I wanted to get to, because as far as you said, it was anachronistic to call the 12 the disciples, but that's just going to get us back to the Gospels, I believe, were written first. So I think we kind of covered that. Is there anything else you wanted to?
Well, so where do you think that Paul directly describes anybody as a disciple?
Well, I don't think that Paul necessarily does. I just think that when people say it's anachronistic to claim the 12 are the disciples, I say two things. I should say, number one, I think other information can inform what certain terminology means, and I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. But also, number two, and most importantly, I do think that Matthew was written and Mark also were probably written before Paul had ever written anything, and that I think Luke was probably written around the same time that Paul was writing. And if I'm right about that, which of course that gets us back into that conversation, but if I'm right about that, then the 12 have already been previously identified as the disciples, and Paul, when he's referencing them offhand, is, this makes sense as to why he can just assume that everybody already knows who these guys are, because it's been propagated all throughout the Christian world. The 12 are these disciples, the disciples are these 12. You see what I mean?
I don't see what you mean, but I guess we'll just have to be at an impasse for that.
Well, and perhaps that could even be a potential future debate, right? When were the Gospels written? That could be a fun one. Because really, that is what this question, when you talk to a fundamentalist versus a mythicist, that really is, I think, what it boils down to is, can these Gospels be trusted? Are they eyewitnesses? Because really, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but if I'm right that there's 5 eyewitnesses to Jesus who have written in the New Testament, the argument's basically done, right? Like, that's just who has 5
well, first you gotta prove that they're eyewitnesses, and considering that the Gospels never attempt to give us any kind of information that would indicate that they were eyewitnesses, they're not written in a way that says that, oh, I am an eyewitness, or like it wasn't written from a first person perspective or anything like that. It's totally different from the other eyewitness accounts that we know of in history. And like for Luke is not at least not a historian. And he doesn't really try too hard to be a historian. He just tries to look like he's trying to record history, because Luke's gospel is actually vastly different than the other historical accounts that existed at the time. I mean, they spend entire sections discussing their sources and why those sources are good sources to use, why they are eyewitnesses. We get none of that from Luke. He just does the bare minimum to look like a historical source, and that's it. So I mean, maybe it does just come down to when you date the Gospels. I just find it absurd to date the Gospels before 70, and especially before Paul.
Yeah, and I think that would be a good, and what's funny too is I ended up having the same conclusion with Dr. Carrier when me and him debated, that it would be a good conversation to have, because I think that fundamentally it does boil down to that question. If eyewitnesses claim that Jesus existed, then the conversation is over, and so the question then becomes, are they eyewitnesses, right? And perhaps that is a future thing, but don't want to go on too long, so I'll go ahead and say I'm at least good from there. And then if you want to, no, I guess we just mentioned that. Sorry. If you have anything else you want to point out, then you can go ahead. And then if not, we can go ahead and.
Yeah, we probably need to get to we need to get to questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do 5. Do you want to do 5 minutes closing?
Sure. I'll let Godless get the last word since I went first. So I'll just say in closing, first off, I will, as I always do, quote, and I guess I don't have it up right now, so I can't quote it directly, but I'll just reference Proverbs 17, which talks about not letting your bragging come from your own mouth, but from the mouth of another. And also later on in the same verse, talks about iron sharpening iron. I bring that up only to say, if you guys think that this was a very awesome and robust defense of the historicity of Jesus or the reliability of Scripture, definitely let me know, and let me know why. And also, if you thought that this was absolutely terrible and the Godless engineer just sent me back to the cleaners, definitely let me know, and let me know why, right? Because those are the only ways that we're going to improve on this. And I do this as an honest pursuit of truth. I think that everybody else who's here is as well. If you weren't doing this for an honest pursuit of truth, you could be somewhere else, but you decided to come here, right? So just want to go ahead and note that. Now, in conclusion, I believe that we have good evidence to suggest that Jesus exists. I think that evidence primarily is found in a collection of sources we call the New Testament, number one, a collection of sources that we call the extra biblical Christian sources, number 2, and then the extra biblical. We didn't really get to the extra biblical non-Christian sources, so I won't really reference that too much in this closing because we basically talked about it not at all, with the exception of a slight bit of Josephus. But nonetheless, I think these do demonstrate very well that a figure named Jesus did exist, that this figure named Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, that he was crucified, and that his followers at least believed him to have been risen on the third day. Whether or not, of course, that is true is a different conversation. But nonetheless, I think it really does boil down to this question of if the New Testament can be trusted, the question really is not one, right? If the New Testament can't be trusted, then there is all of a sudden a very open question as to whether or not the existence of Jesus can be can be proven, I guess is the best way, can be evidenced, if that's a word to make up an adjective, right? But if indeed the New Testament can be trusted, if those titles are accurate, if in 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, when he says he's witnessing these kinds of things, if that's accurate, if church tradition claiming that these people actually passed on this oral tradition to people like Polycarp and all that, if that kind of stuff is accurate, then we actually have a very solid chain of evidence demonstrating Jesus' existence. And all that boils down in the end fundamentally to the scriptures. When do you date them? Who wrote them? Are they eyewitnesses? And perhaps, like I said, that's another conversation that needs to be had at another point in time. But nonetheless, this has been a good conversation. I appreciate you guys. Shalom and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to whom I give all the glory. And with that, go ahead and
that was 3.5 minutes. Godless, you have up to 5 minutes, and you can start when you're ready.
I'm really excited to get to the question, so I'll try to make this brief. I was not convinced by any of the evidence that was presented here tonight. In fact, if anything, I really don't think that anybody should be persuaded by the evidence that was given tonight, just because a lot of it doesn't make sense. Like I mentioned how the dating of Luke and the census, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to read extra information into Paul. I just found a lot of things didn't make sense to me. And I can agree that I don't understand everything, in history or everything like that. I'm fully aware that, I'm not a historian and all this other stuff, but it seems like if it were historical, like if these things were true, then we should be able to easily understand them. And at least just as they're presented in the actual sources. And what I get from the actual sources is that Paul only knew of Jesus through visions in scripture. And that's the only way that anybody has ever known Jesus. So for me, it just, I guess, pushed me farther into the mythicist camp, if anything. But I hope that everybody here got something out of the debate tonight. I know we kind of spent a lot on the historicity, I guess, of the Gospels and when they're dated and everything like that. But I thought that it was a great debate, and I'm sure that there are people on both sides that agree. And I just would hope that some people would come away thinking that at least the mythicist position isn't as crazy as some people think. But here's hoping. But let's get to the comments. That'll be it for me.